Welcome to Wiser Dialogue, conversations with women of color about issues, policies, and research that impact our lives. Today, our guests are YoungMin Yi, a doctoral student at Cornell University studying sociology, and Demetria Howard-Watkins, a family lawyer in Dallas. Today, our conversation will focus on parental rights. As many of you know, next month we will be celebrating Mother's Day, and then Father's Day, and then the summer. And quite often around parental rights, especially in custody situations, children may be shifting from living with one parent through the school year to residing with another parent for the summer break. So Demetria, I'd like to start with you. Could you give us a definition or a legal definition for parental rights?
Thank you so much for having me, Rhonda, on Wiser Dialogue. I'm very happy to be here and to expound more on parental rights in the legal sense. So just as a basic definition, a working definition for what parental rights are, parental rights overall, uniformly, are basically the right to have custody and control over your biological children. It is the right to participate fully in their education, in their development, and in the formation of their core beliefs and values. It's understood that unless otherwise ruled by a court of law or predetermined by the parents themselves, the biological parents have the sole discretion to make these decisions about their children, not the government. So that's at its root. And we have pre-existing jurisprudence, we have legal precedent at the Supreme Court level that substantiate parental rights as a fundamental liberty.
So let me get you to expound on that. So you said biological parents. How does that change if parents aren't legally married? Then who?
It doesn't change. It doesn't change. We have a biological mother and we have an identified biological father. They have supremacy over the upbringing of the child born between the two of them.
Okay, so
the classification of their the classification of their relationship is irrelevant.
So why is it that we often see parental rights seem to be more assigned to the mother than father, or am I confusing that with custody of the child as opposed to parental rights?
Well, we don't have a maternal presumption. We're not supposed to have a maternal presumption anyway when it comes to determining what's in the best interest of the children from a custody perspective. But, and I'm not going to say unfortunately, but traditionally, through the past division of labor, the dynamics within a male-female heterosexual relationship, it has just been custom that women are responsible for the nurturing and the general day-to-day responsibility of raising children. Customarily and traditionally, it's women who make the choice whether or not to remain in the home, to take care of the children full time, to structure work life around family life. So by and large, traditionally, the structure of the home in some cases makes it predetermined how the custody will fall in the court of law if parents were to pursue that and deciding where the children live one time or another.
Okay, so since I've sort of pushed this into that space of custodial of the child, talk to us a little bit about how one loses parental rights, because then I think that'll move us into Ming's area around foster care and the well-being of children and looking at that intersection between family inequality and government policy. So Demetria, if you'll tell us a little bit about how does one lose parental rights?
Okay. Before getting to that point, it's important to emphasize that even when there is disruption in the current custody arrangement, it's understood that if the government is to intervene at all to protect the children, the sole goal, the top priority is to always try to equip the parents who may have acted abusively or neglectfully with tools and skills and abilities so that the reunification of the family and the stability of the family remains intact. However, legislatively, over the last 30 or 40 years, I believe it was in 1980 with the Child Welfare Act, we saw a shift from, sometimes reunification and trying to attain and sustain stability of the family. Perhaps that may not be in the best interest of the children. So there are grounds for termination of parental rights. And that is a very, very, very serious undertaking, for which the court of law, the state, I should say, they have the burden of demonstrating that the case in and of itself meets the standards for termination. So most of the grounds for termination are pretty uniform. They're all codified statutorily in each jurisdiction, each state. But at first glance, typically it's abuse or neglect to such a degree that no rehabilitation, no services, no resources made available to the parents would help. In fact, you have parents in child protection cases that may work all of their services, but still may have missing components that would make it viable for the children to return. So we see abuse and neglect. We may have circumstances where a parent has neglected a child. So you have a circumstance where a mother and a father, they have a child, or let me be a little bit more current. We have two people who have a child and they can't take care of the child. And so they leave the child with a person. It could be a neighbor, it could be a relative. And based on my understanding, I think the minimum amount of time that must pass is about 6 months before the folks who have the child, related or otherwise, they can pursue full custody in the court of law, because by leaving that child with a parent, leaving that child with a neighbor or with a relative for 6 months, not indicating at all your plans to return, not providing any financial assistance, like there's no understanding that you're coming back, you have grounds for trying to seek custody. And then you have circumstances where if a mother, while carrying the child, tries to, harm the child, if she's, engaging in drug use, or she's done some, potentially catastrophic things while pregnant, that it's just not viable for the child to be with a mother. You have circumstances where if the father of the child tried to cause harm, serious harm to the mother or to the child while mom is pregnant, his parental rights can be terminated. And then there is the catch-all. Like here in Texas, in Chapter 161 of the Texas Family Code, we have what's called O grounds. So that's subsection O of Chapter 161 that says, if it's in the best interest of the children for the parental rights to be terminated. So that runs the gamut. There's all sorts of circumstances that can be in place for the state to make its case, meet its burden that it's in the best interest. So that catch-all there, that's very, very, very fact-intensive and specific.
Okay, so thank you. So as you're talking about ways to have parental rights lost, YoungMin, this is where you do a great deal of work in terms of thinking about family inequality and then public policy. And so one of the things that I'd like for you to talk a little bit about first is foster care, because I presume that when parental rights are lost, that usually means, or if there are challenges with the children being with the parents, that they're going in, if they go into what people call the system, that is going to be foster care. So can you tell us a little bit about what we know about foster care, what we don't know about foster care in terms of people showing up, having the reason that you're being called match with what's really happening, and whether or not you feel like we're being called to document all of the cases that may be happening and how that might change by race. And
sure. Yeah, so thanks for that. And I'm learning a lot already from Demetria, because I'm not working on the ground. So I'm seeing this from a sociologist and demographer's perspective. So this is a really great dialogue, and I'm really grateful to be part of it. So first, I just want to kind of refine like a time ordering piece. So not all the parents of children in the foster care system haven't all lost parental rights. So parental rights among children who are in foster care, some of them, in order to be available or put up for adoption will require a termination of parental rights, but that there isn't a total overlap in children facing those sets of circumstances. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. So the foster care system is big and important and has objectives of establishing safety, permanency, and well-being for the child. And so as Demetria mentioned, the express objectives of the foster care system or involvement with it are to protect the well-being of children who have been determined to be in really acute, they're supposed to be some of the most extreme contexts of maltreatment or dangerous care environment for these children. So in theory, they've already proceeded, these families and children have already proceeded through a pretty rigorous system of evaluation and investigation to determine whether the conditions of the care's living arrangement are indeed dangerous and acute enough that the only option is to remove them from the home, at least, and it's supposed to be temporary. And so even within this shift in priorities about prioritizing the child remaining in the care of their biological parents, there's still a motivation to return the child to that setting if there's a way that it can be modified or there can be supports provided that would make that safe. Some of the, so a lot of my work though focuses on the fact that involvement with the foster care system is unequally distributed across the child population at the national level and within states. I guess people working in the areas of family inequality and child welfare, the child welfare system, have documented kind of forever the racial disparities in involvement with the system at all levels. So children of color, and particularly Black children and children who are Native American, are disproportionately likely to end up being reported, investigated, and confirmed for maltreatment and placed in foster care, so all different levels. And the degree to which that's actually mapping onto underlying incidence rates of maltreatment is still a question from a social scientific level and policy level. And so what we find in the data are just picking up the cases of maltreatment that come to the attention of the state, right? So there are mandated reporters, but there aren't people like on the lookout for cases of potential maltreatment. There is a responsibility and duty to report if there are, for certain people in positions where their responsibilities include reporting, but we don't know, there's presumably some overlap, but we don't know if there's the patterning that we see in the foster care system is mapping onto lived risks of maltreatment. And so that's a data question that's really important to understanding racial disparity within the system. The sense, at least in a lot of the literature that I'm seeing, and I think I just want to mention a scholar who's done a lot of really important work on this, Dorothy Roberts, in thinking about racial disproportionality in system involvement. The sense is that, the disparities are so great that it's evidence suggests that families of color are being overly surveyed by the child welfare system, or that the criteria or assessment of danger for children of color in their homes seems to be taking place at a rate that's kind of implausibly high. And so there are more kids being removed from homes than should be, given our understanding of the incidence of risk. But these are all data questions, but at a population level, the patterns are concerning from a perspective of racial and class inequality.
So here's what I'm hearing. So we've got this notion about the state is going to lay down what parental rights are. The state is laying down who should report, right? So the state is mandating who has to be reporters, and I presume those are people like teachers. And who else is a mandated reporter?
Police officers, attorneys, and I believe there was an effort here in Texas by our legislature to pass a bill amending the requirement that cosmetologists be added to the list as well. So with that list expanding, and there are punishments that go along with a failure to report, so we have poor children of color interacting in schools every single day. And teachers have, I believe it's within 24 to 48 hours to report a suspected abuse or neglect. It is quite easy to open the door for child protective services to enter your life.
Okay, and I find that interesting that Texas is asking cosmetologists to
potentially, I believe.
Right? I mean,
yeah, that's my understanding. While Texas being Texas, simultaneously trying to require that if you want to do hair in Texas, you don't even need a cosmetology license anymore. But we want you to call in on families. So
and I was actually thinking about that. Maybe I mean a go figure is absolutely right, but I'm wondering if there is something that people are thinking that the conversation between the child and the person who's doing your hair is a little more relaxed. Maybe there are bruises that folks are actually, I'm thinking, are being hidden by hair that a cosmetologist is then going to recognize. But be that what it may, what I'd like for us to kind of shift this conversation, and maybe it's not even a shift, because YoungMin has said to us, look, the data disproportionately reflects that Black children and Native American children are, make sure I have this right, are more likely to be in foster care, and I presume that means that they're going to have a higher rate of some interaction with child protective services. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
I believe that's correct.
I'm sorry. Say that again.
I believe that's correct as well. But there's one missing piece that I wanted to highlight. So I don't want the assumption to be that once Child Protection Services enters the picture and does the required investigation and makes a determination of removal, that the children just remain in foster care until the parents or caregivers complete required services or make required adjustments to get the kids back. At least in Texas, and I can only speak to the jurisdiction in which I'm licensed, there is an opportunity for a parent at the inception of the removal to list a few names and addresses of relatives or people, for whom they have trust to take care of their kids while they complete the required services or make the required steps. But what I have found, and this is the absolutely most unfortunate thing, is that, you'll have a parent list off people who are otherwise deemed reliable, who have a relationship with their children and, may to them have the appropriate space and the appropriate resources to care for the children. So what the departments do, and like I said, I'm speaking for Texas overall, they will go ahead and complete a home study, which is a pretty thorough background check on the folks who are vying for placement. And so, that person's income is scrutinized, the sources of their income, the adequacy and suitability of the home, that's also scrutinized. And then, it needs to be deemed appropriate. And if the department, for whatever reason, denies the placement and the parents continue to go down the list of proposed caretakers of the children and everything comes back denied, and the children's attorney and the parent's attorney in the case, they are unsuccessful in their pursuit of a placement hearing to debate and allow a judge to decide, that's when the children are placed in foster care. But the good news is that the parents have the opportunity throughout the case to always present or propose additional caretakers that come forward, because the ultimate goal is to get the parents on the right track, and reunification, that's priority. And again, in Texas, the priority is reunification, family, and then foster care. But when you think about the fact that if you have, and I hope I'm not being too casual with this connection, but when you have folks of color who are coming in, and disproportionately they are under-resourced, they suffer from instability in employment, instability in their housing, they're coping with traumas that have not been addressed, because there is a culture of silence when it comes to abuse and depression in minority communities. I said, I'm being very careful about making these connections, but when you have folks like that to come, in contact with the department, most of the time their family, who they propose to care for the kids, they're struggling as well. And so you will unfortunately have children that remain in the foster care system. And then the kids, of course, are facing all sorts of trauma surrounding being separated from their parents, being in new schools, around new people. And just to be clear, the visitation schedules that parents have when their kids are in care, it can be as little as an hour a week, typically at a CPS office. So the visitation and the ability to maintain a bond with your child has become institutionalized. And as another note, there was an article, and I believe it was July 2017, it was in the New York Times, and they are talking about child protection being the new Jane Crow, because if you are an under-resourced person coming in contact, it's almost like a punishment. I mean, you fail before you even get started. So I thought it would be important to add that piece.
Well, I'm actually coming to you.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate your pointing about under-resourced folks are coming into the system, and then the way the system is set up, it can actually exacerbate that. And then the trauma that the children are going through, because YoungMin, that's right in your lane where you're talking about the trauma that children are experiencing and then potential consequences for them later in their life. So would you speak a little bit to what you're finding in your research about the consequences?
Sure. I mean, so in theory, that in contact with the child welfare system, if it were able to meet the objectives that are identified, should really be helping families and children, right? So it's possible that the services that they're being provided with are providing, for example, substance use treatment for parents, or access to income supports to which families are eligible, or if a child needs to be set up with a more appropriate academic support, helping identify these resources. But at least descriptive evidence is showing that children who end up in foster care have really comparatively poor outcomes relative to children who are their age peers, right? And so part of that is absolutely the trauma that they're exposed to prior to entering into the system, right? These children are not living in vacuums. And so when you sever ties, it's not just about the biological tie, but it's exactly what Demetria mentioned. It's the schools, it's the familiarity, and it's a stigmatized identity, an experience in the United States and likely in other systems as well that have kind of built out child welfare systems, and tasking the new care environment with not only providing in the moment for a child's care, as well as addressing this accumulated experience and shock for the child is huge. And both foster and caregivers of origin don't always have the resources or the supports to manage those experiences. And I wanted to point to one thing about the community environment, because and the community level disadvantage. So an individual who doesn't have access to income supports, for example, is statistically more likely to be embedded within a more disadvantaged network, right? We know that low-income neighborhoods are called such because they're people and families that don't have access to resources. And so when you layer child welfare system involvement with the welfare system, with the higher risks of parental incarceration, with heavy surveillance from other systems, with kids who are more likely to get heavy punishment in schools and labor market inequalities, there is just an overwhelming, multifaceted, interconnected system of disadvantage that is disproportionately and substantially affecting the same communities and families and children who are already at higher risk of ending up in the child welfare system. And so it's really hard to think about how asking families to kind of draw on their own resources isn't going to be affected by those multiple layers of disadvantage that we see in the United States. And so while the kind of kin naming part of the assessment of placement options is great, and I think expanding that and strengthening that piece of the decision-making process is really important to minimize additional disruption to a child and family's network. it doesn't necessarily give access to the resources that a family might need. And the idea that a nuclear family is like somewhat economically independent from an extended family is a very particular upper middle class ideal of family, right? And so that's something, I think one thing that's difficult with codified practice is that it's not always able to take into account the shared experiences of people outside the nuclear family that's at the core of the investigation or the system response.
Okay.
I think you make an excellent point. One, those layers of interconnectedness, I mean, I think that thinking about how they interact, much less trying to figure out how to disentangle them for any particular policy recommendation just is an absolute nightmare. Well, thank you. I want to thank my guest, YoungMin Yi, doctoral student in sociology at Cornell University, and Demetria Howard-Watkins, a family lawyer in Dallas, Texas.
You have been watching Wiser Dialogue, The Missing Viewpoint.